Hello, so here I am at Cliveden, which is a stately home in Buckinghamshire. It's derived from the Anglo-Saxon words cliff amongst the valleys. You see this inscription up here, constructed in 1851 by the grace of God, the 14th year of Queen Victoria, or 14th year of Victoria. It doesn't actually say Queen, it mentions her reign. So this is the third house to stand on this site. And this is after the style of Palladio, the 16th century Italian architect with an English twist. Anyhow, so yeah, we're above the River Thames. There's about 40 meters above the River Thames. I mean, the house, obviously taller than that, was built right up here. So the first house dates from the 1660s. This is the third house on this site. Anyway, so who was it first of all got it? Oh yeah, the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, the second Duke of Buckingham, who'd grown up with Charles II and James II as his playmates, had been a royalist. His father had been assassinated in Portsmouth by John Felton because John Felton was incensed that the first Duke of Buckingham had launched the disastrous raid on Cadiz against the Spanish. Anyway, coming to the second Duke who built this house, he was a royalist, went into exile with the Stuarts, came back in glory in 1660 and constructed this house, lived in some style and was an enormous philanderer. He thinks he had no children with his good wife, but plenty with his mistresses. He married a Miss Fairfax, daughter of Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was a son of a Yorkshire peer, as in a parliamentarian, being on the other side of the English Civil War. Anyway, and it passed, I think, to the Earl of Orkney, bought it. Hamilton was his surname, who was a military officer, was away a lot of the time, left his wife in charge a lot. And I can't remember who the Duke of Sutherland have at some point. And so now, in those days, they normally would have built a house down by the river. And the river is right down there. You can't see it through these trees. But he said no, he'd built at the highest point because he was a huntsman and an equestrian, that Duke of Buckingham, second Duke of Buckingham, who built the house. And indeed he died because he caught a chill whilst out riding in his 50s. 50 was very old in those days. But he decided to build it right up here. And from this coign of vantage, it affords you a most splendiferous panorama almost. So if you go right to the top of the house, look at that, you can't see the Thames beyond the lawn. You can see on the far bank of the Thames, you know, we're not far from Cookham or Marlow and so on. And people would come and go by the river because of the roads were in a very poor state till the 18th century. And so long distance travel is often faster and more comfortable by boat and then up from the river. So like hunting around here, not too far from London and not too far from Windsor Castle. So you can enjoy the bucolic life up here. Good bracing ventilation in the winter. And so had some landscaped gardens, had an outdoor manege, if you will, in this slightly sunken garden. I'll show you at the end of the lawn. So yeah. And then it burnt down again in the 18th, well, it was the mid-19th century, yeah. That's why the current house is from 1851. Right, at the far end of the lawn, you may see it's a bit sunken around that statue, and that's where they used to exercise the horses. Here you see the balustrade from Villa Borghese in Rome. So that was from the Baroque era, and then the Astors, Waldorf Astor, I think, is the one who purchased this in the 1870s when he was the United States ambassador to Italy, and had it obviously dismantled, shipped over here, reassembled here. Wow, from a very, very, very wealthy German-American family. And that Astor, well, I'm sort of skipping ahead a few owners, became proprietor in the 1880s. He settled in the United Kingdom and he became a British subject, as was then in the 1890s. On the ship from the United States, his son met a young 5-foot-tall divorcee who was originally Nancy Langhorne, married her, became Nancy Astor. Now that was little short of scandalous in the 1890s. Divorce was not the done thing, no matter if you were sinned against rather than sinning. So that was not respectable. But anyway, that Mr. Astor, he was elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament for Plymouth Sutton, and his father was elevated to the peerage. When the father died, that Honourable Astor became the second Lord Astor, and so he was elevated to the House of Peers, which he hadn't wanted. And so how could he keep that constituency of Plymouth Sutton in family hands? He got his wife, Nancy Astor, was elected, and so she's the first woman to take her seat in the House of Commons in 1919. Not the first woman to be elected there too, that being Constance Gore Booth, the Countess Markievicz, who was a Sinn Féiner, and because she was in denial about being British, she refused to take her oath to her sovereign lord, King George V. Anyway, so what else should have said? In the mid 18th century, it belonged to Frederick, Prince of Wales. Now, Frederick was born in Hanover, Germany, but then his grandfather, King George, became King George I. In 1714, and it was whilst also being King of Hanover. And so his father George I and his father was George II, his grandfather was George I. They moved over. They left Frederick behind in Germany for years, and his parents loathed him. And when Frederick finally moved over, he had several siblings whom he'd never met, he'd been born over here. So Frederick had to learn English. His family were not at all keen on him, so on. And then he married that Augusta of Saxe-Coburg. She gave birth to his daughter Augusta, and Frederick's mother wanted to be present at the parturition, but anyway, Prince Frederick didn't want his mother to watch his wife give birth, so when his wife went into labour, had to put in a horse-drawn carriage and moved away so she gave birth somewhere else to a daughter also named Augusta. That Frederick, Prince of Wales, he was the father of King George III. Frederick, Prince of Wales, never became king because he predeceased his own father. So the crown went from George II straight to his grandson, George III. Anyway, there was it called The Mask of Alfred, was put on here at an outdoor amphitheatre, and that was a play in 1740, and then the closing number of that, and I can't remember who composed the music. It was Thomas Arne. The librettist was James Thompson, a North Briton, and the closing number is "Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. When Britain first at heaven's command arose, arose, arose from out the azure main, this was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sang this strain." But anyway, he died, and I can't remember who owned it after a while. There was George Provender, as is known, a man of the most egregious corpulence, and he got himself that cognomen because he was notorious for his exceptional greed. Oh yeah, if you look up here, this Latin inscription, you can see completed the ingenious work by the brilliance of Charles Barry, architect, 1851. So he's the same architect who rebuilt the House of Commons after the 1834 fire. Him and I can't remember who the other guy is, Augustus Pugin, who was of French extraction. I think Pugin's father was a refugee after the French Revolution. Look at this water tower with a clock, and it still functions as a water tower right out the front. And there's that 30 meters high, very, very high for the time. And look, is that right up there? It's that Hermes right at the top of it. Okay, so most of it is a hotel. Anyway, the Astors owned it from the 1890s, and then the Cliveden set met here in the 1920s and 30s, this informal social circle of aristocrats and politicians, but they spanned the political spectrum. There were communists, there were reactionaries. The Astors were blackguarded by the far left gutter press, saying that it was a sort of hotbed of Nazism, but that's not true, although most of them did want peace with Germany, and Nancy Astor was an appeaser. She was a Christian Scientist, a woman of the most forthright opinions, who was totally anti-alcohol, but had no hesitation about serving it to her guests, and was against medical care because, of course, you should pray for a miraculous cure. Anyone who was ill simply lacked moral fibre. But when her husband died, she went to live with her daughter in Lincolnshire. And then there was in the swimming pool here, the outdoor pool, in 1861, 1961, Jack Perfumer, Minister for War, we'd now say Defence Minister, he met the 19-year-old Christine Keeler, who was a stripper who lived in London, who'd already had a child outside wedlock, which in those days is considered very shameful. But anyway, he was a married man, much older than her, began an affair with her. She was generous with her favours. She was also being bedded by the Soviet naval attaché, Colonel Yevgeny Ivanov. And then that came to the attention of a rather supercilious Labour MP for Lambeth, and questions were asked in the House of Commons. So John Profumo unwisely denied it, so he'd lied in the House of Commons. So therefore he wrote to the Prime Minister Harold Macmillan to resign, and Macmillan accepted the resignation, and in his letter impliedly hadn't even read the resignation letter, saying the contents of your letter have been communicated to me. Well, they were communicated by his own eyes, but Jack Profumo resigned from Parliament. And where was he? He was MP for Stratford upon Avon, Conservative seat under Nazim Zahawi. I don't know who has it now, but that Profumo, he lived on till the noughties, and he tried to redeem himself by doing charitable work at Toynbee Hall. I think he was elected a local councillor, and actually his grandson was at school with me, my last year at school, Profumo KS, a King Scholar. And I said to him, Profumo, are you Jack Profumo's grandson? And he said yes. After Jack Profumo died, his own son published a memoir bringing the house down, that his parents had tried to shield him from the scandal. It was all over the newspapers at the time. And Nancy Astor, well, she was living in Lincolnshire with a daughter. She was slightly gaga by 1961, and the servants tried to hide the scandal for her. She would not want to know, as she was a woman who was morally punctilious, that this has been a hotbed of adultery, her house. So she ordered her driver to take it all the way down from Lincolnshire, it's a few hours. But unfortunately, because she was losing it, when she got here, she forgot why she'd come down here. She was a bit gaga. So the servants had tried to switch off the television news so she didn't find out about the scandal, make sure she couldn't see it in the newspapers. Anyway, she died in 1964, a very old woman. And she's the woman who Winston Churchill had a contretemps with. Notoriously, she said to him, if I was married to you, Winston, I'd put poison in your coffee. And he said, if I were married to you, Nancy, I'd drink it. What else? Yeah, the Astors, they started from the Waldorf, Germany, moved to New York just after the American Revolution. And John Jacob Astor had been a flute maker, became a furrier, very, very wealthy, bought a lot of Manhattan, which was then open countryside. Look, it's a hotel now, quite pricey. What does it say up front? Okay. So what the foundations by George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, was formerly located on this site in the reign of Charles II. So the foundations are original, but none of the rest of the house is original. He built 4 stories plus an attic, and then it was the Earl of Orkney who reduced it to 3 stories only. He thought it was too extravagant. So it's huge. I mean, it's over 100 meters long at the back. Anyway, so that's enough. There's an octagon where many of them are buried, and it was the whole thing was lent to the Canadian Army in the First World War. So wounded soldiers and sick soldiers were treated here. Over 24,000 soldiers were treated here, not all at the same time. Now the hospital couldn't save all of them, so some of them are buried in the grounds. A few Americans were treated here. About 50 Canadian soldiers interred here, and 2 Americans. Nancy Astor was a very generous woman, and she would go around trying to raise their morale, but also say, don't feel too sorry for yourself. You've got to have some fighting spirit. You've got to have the will to win. Come on, man. Pray to Jesus. And there was one soldier who'd really lost the will to live, said, I'm dying. She said, you're not dying. You are dying. Saying, don't be silly. You're going to live. You see this gold watch? If you're still alive in a month, I'll give it to you. And he did live over a month, and she did give it to him, and then he completely recovered. He lived onto that, so a little incentive. Okay, so that's up to the clock tower. I'm not sure if we can go this. Most owned by the National Trust. In the 1970s, it was leased to Stanford University, and a lot of American students came to stay here. So it's had many, many different uses. There were times when the house wasn't even occupied for about 9 years. So many stories. We could do it all day here, all about Cliveden, and it's spelled as Cliveden. The Churchill meeting room. Wow. So the Cliveden set. Lawrence of Arabia came here. Winston Churchill came here. I'm trying to think. Kenneth Graham, who lived across the river, he authored Winter of the Willows. He came here. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Anyone who's here. Franklin Delano Roosevelt came here. All sorts of very important people. The German ambassador Joachim von Ribbentrop. Some people were here, part of the Anglo-German fellowship, trying to prevent a Second World War. Anyway, that is a little view of Cliveden. Thank you for your kind attention.